Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Mr. Lawrence. You are probably going to be one of my favorite guests right now to start off this kind of series of me coming back to the show. But do you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. I'm Mark Lawrence. I'm a professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin and someone who's written a fair amount about LBJ over the years. And I also served as director of the LBJ Presidential Library for about 5 years up until 2024.
Now, did you join the library because you were just fascinated with LBJ? What was your kind of start into at least getting involved into more about learning about LBJ and then running about him as well?
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate way back in 2000 to get a job teaching history at the University of Texas. And, there right across campus is the LBJ Presidential Library. So I had this golden opportunity to, do my own research, to learn about this institution. And over many years, I became more and more involved. So when the director position came open, I threw my name into the hat in I guess it was 2019, and things worked out, and I really really loved my time there. It's a wonderful institution.
Before joining there, what was your perspective on LBJ? Like if you look at like maybe some history courses in high school, or if you took it a little bit farther, you learn about the Vietnam War, LBJ's name comes up, so does JFK's briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really a fascinating thing that I've spent some time reflecting on. I'm from Massachusetts originally. And I think it's fair to say, there's a lot of prejudice against LBJ, at the time of his life, but even retrospectively, because let's face it, he was a Southerner. He was someone who had mannerisms and spoke in ways that, people from the Northeast perhaps don't find all that sympathetic. And then the other factor for me is that, I really got into teaching and writing about history out of an interest in the Vietnam War. And I think that is probably LBJ's, darkest chapter, if I can put it that way. So there were a couple of strikes against LBJ in my mind. But honestly, I kept an open mind. And as I learned more about him and about his presidency, and certainly as I, had the privilege of leading the LBJ Library, my thinking about him really changed in really significant ways. And I think something like, what has played out in my own head has kind of played out in American society more generally. His stock has really risen, I think, over the years for a variety of reasons that we can get into if you like.
Yeah, I'll ask you about those reasons. I just want to ask, did the information that you got on LBJ or kind of the changing perspective really come from the LBJ tapes? Because for me, it's been a kind of a opening of a door into really understanding the man. And I think he says it in one of his tapes, but he says these tapes will absolve us. When he's talking about his campaign, I think it's amongst all the books that are coming out that are calling him anti-Kennedy and all these other things. He kind of states that to Robert McNamara that these tapes will kind of clear us up.
I do think that the tapes have enabled us to take another look at LBJ in a way that has mostly worked in favor of his legacy and how we might think about him in retrospect. I mean, I think by and large, they depict a president who was extremely savvy, who was very sophisticated in his approach to politics and policymaking, who is very serious. I think there's a kind of caricature of LBJ out there that he was vulgar and crude. And, you really don't see that kind of thing on the tapes. And, it's conceivable that, the LBJ we see on the tape doesn't capture everything that he was about as a person, but it's certainly, there's hundreds of hours, right? And taken together, they really suggest to me, as I say, what a serious, effective, savvy politician and leader he was.
I guess I would have to ask, do you think that his whole career or his whole idea of the presidency, do you think it's all enveloped by the Vietnam War? Do you think it's just that's his legacy, that's what he left behind was the Vietnam War when everybody thinks of Johnson? Or do you think there was other factors that should stand out that necessarily don't get the credit that he deserves?
Well, I mean, I think that Vietnam is inescapable and must always be a huge part of Lyndon Johnson's legacy. But I think that there are plenty of other aspects to his presidency that we need to keep in mind when thinking about who he was, what his presidency was all about. And And those have to do with civil rights, with Medicare, with the war on poverty, with environmental legislation, with education, right? This array of policy areas that were central to his Great Society agenda. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that the Johnson presidency, working, of course, with like-minded allies in Congress, really transformed American life in a lot of ways. Now, reasonable people can disagree about whether, all of those changes were positive and productive. I mean, there is an argument, that these initiatives expanded the role and invasiveness of government, right? There's an interesting critique of the Great Society as a kind of liberal approach to governance run amok. But still, that's an interesting debate to have. But I think we have to acknowledge that LBJ, first and foremost, was about more than Vietnam, and that many of these bills that he signed into law really had a transformative effect on the United States.
Could you maybe talk about a certain bill or a certain thing that was something that LBJ did that was actually very good, either for civil rights or for really anything of American society? Because I feel like a lot of this gets neglected. Usually when civil rights gets brought up, especially if you're talking with people who are fans or were more inside with the party, like the Kennedy's administration, you hear a lot about like, well, that's Kennedy's, and Kennedy was going to do civil rights, but he died, and then it'll lead to like speculation of whoever did it. But the main thing is that I believe in my mind, Johnson was the only person at that time, based on his personality, to be able to get those bills passed. And whether he did it, like he says on his tapes, for Kennedy, or if he did it for some other thing, I kind of look at it like that Southerner was a big advantage to how he was dealing with politics. Because what he explains on the tapes is Kennedy never went down there and had a beer with them on the Hill. I did. I had those conversations, and that was like, yeah, that's exactly how I think politics goes. And he kind of confirmed it for me on an aspect of like, it's like a fraternity a little bit. And Kennedy didn't play that ball. He was playing a more other structured thing. And I just thought that was very interesting to his character. A lot of people don't talk about.
Yeah, I very much agree with what you're getting at. I think I'm struck by how many people who may have a passing knowledge of American history in the 1960s will attribute the civil rights accomplishments to JFK, right? This was JFK's agenda. And Kennedy really had a hard time, I think, with civil rights. And, part of that was he was elected by such a narrow margin. In 1960, he understood that to get reelected, or really to have any effectiveness even during his first term, he was going to have to hold on to the Democratic Party in the South, which of course was by and large a party that was deeply attached to segregation and very suspicious of civil rights. So Kennedy was going to have a hard time, I think, with passing meaningful civil rights legislation. LBJ comes into office under tragic circumstances in 1963, and he picked up the legislation that, it is true, Kennedy had supported in his final year. But I agree with you that LBJ was far better positioned to advance that legislation and ultimately to sign it than Kennedy would have been in a similar time period. And a big strength of LBJ's was, as you mentioned, that he was from the South. He sort of spoke the language of the South. He had more credibility with the staunchest opponents of civil rights, which isn't to say he convinced all of them by a long shot to support the legislation. But I think it's fair to say that he spoke with more credibility on this issue in a way that made the civil rights agenda somewhat more palatable to people who otherwise would have been staunchly opposed. And I think, part of this too is that he had more confidence to pursue this agenda than someone like JFK might have had, at least in Kennedy's first term. I think there's a reasonably strong argument that if Kennedy had been elected to a second term and didn't face the need, to be reelected, he probably would have taken more political risks. But I don't think there's any question that in 1963, 1964, LBJ was the better bet to get significant civil rights legislation passed. And indeed, he got the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed before the 1964 election, right? And then in 1965, he passed, or I shouldn't say that, Congress passed, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I think LBJ was most proud of. If he was asked what was his greatest accomplishment as president, and he often pointed to the Voting Rights Act, which protected voting rights for all Americans, but especially African Americans, in a way that was really transformative to the American political system.
I told you I wasn't just going to focus on Vietnam, but I am going to ask a Vietnam related question. When it came to his involvement with the troops, he increased troop involvement into Vietnam. Why do you think the purpose of that was, or what do you think his overall goal was? Because obviously, if you've listened to the LBJ tapes, George Reedy comes up. I heard a really interesting interview with him where he was kind of explaining, I think, to someone on some news, it wasn't Bill Moyers, it was someone on like some news interview, but he had explained that when there was a moment that when Kennedy got killed and Johnson administration was coming in, that the Johnson people were looking at the Kennedy people and they saw that he was bringing in troops into Vietnam, and Johnson was just going to keep what was going with Kennedy's administration, just kind of keep it going or kind of fulfill those things. And that's why he increased it. He said that in an interview, and it was a lot different from what I've heard. Obviously, everyone says LBJ, LBJ, how many kids are you going to kill today? It's commonly said in comments and so much. And I don't know. For me, it was like, I think there's probably more of a balance here. It seems like every president kind of was afraid to be the one that surrendered or lost a war. And it seemed like LBJ kind of was doing a little bit of the keeping the same things Kennedy was doing, but at the same time trying to handle it on his own. And then he literally figured out way later, maybe a couple of years later, that, yeah, why didn't I just bring my own people in here? That's the mistake I made. I should have had my own people, but I kept the Kennedy administration.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating question. Did LBJ simply carry on with the policies that Kennedy had already laid in place when it came to Vietnam, or did he move in a sharply different direction? And there's a lively debate about this. Reasonable people can disagree. This is certainly contested terrain where I think we'll never probably get ironclad answers that convince everyone. To me, I'm persuaded that LBJ really was the key decision maker when it came to Vietnam. I think JFK clearly inherited a big problem, and he was wary, exactly as you say, of being the president who lost Vietnam. He saw political and geostrategic pressures to do whatever was necessary to prevent Vietnam from falling to the communists. But I do think there's a fair amount of evidence with JFK that he was a pretty sophisticated thinker when it came to foreign policy, and he was very wary of using American force when there was uncertainty about the possibility that the United States would achieve its objectives. If you look at Cuba, you look at Berlin, you look at the Congo, you look at Laos, a number of cases, you see, I think, despite the rhetoric of pay any price, bear any burden, that Kennedy was actually quite cautious. So to me, there is good reason to think that he would have understood the problems of Vietnam and maybe not simply washed American hands of Vietnam. That was obviously an unattractive option, but he would have worked really hard to find alternatives to a major escalation. I think LBJ was a much less sophisticated thinker when it came to foreign policy, and maybe that's no surprise. He hadn't had as much experience as JFK had when it came to foreign policy, especially with respect to the third world, as his predecessor. He bought pretty readily into ideas like the domino idea, the necessity of containment, the problems with American credibility if South Vietnam fell to the communists. And he believed that the United States simply must do everything necessary to prevent the collapse of South Vietnam. And by the beginning of 1965, that clearly meant the introduction of greater levels of American force, whether that was bombing or ground troops or both, as it turned out. I think LBJ fell pretty readily into that way of thinking about the problem. LBJ also, this is not unrelated to the domestic arena as well. I think another reason why LBJ made the decisions he made that is perhaps a bit distinct from Kennedy and his thinking about Vietnam was that LBJ really wanted to protect his credibility in Congress. And he was really afraid that if Vietnam fell to the communists, his critics in Congress, in the Republican Party, the Dixiecrat wing of the Democrats, would become less reliable partners in adopting the Great Society. So here's a way in which LBJ's domestic ambitions arguably created additional incentives to escalate in Vietnam. So these were not separate issues, I think. They were bound together in LBJ's mind in a way that, unfortunately, I think, led him to think in more hawkish ways about Vietnam.
Do you believe he was really paying attention to what was going on in Vietnam in the beginning? Because it seemed like a lot of the earlier tapes are a lot of dealing with press. Most of them are dealing with press relations, issues of slander articles or just certain things that are coming out, polls. He's very obsessed with this. Of course, everyone's, 64 happens. You got the election. Everyone's kind of focused on trying to get reelected. But I mean, that was up to like 65, maybe middle to late 65. He's still dealing with a lot of press stories. And there's something later I want to talk to you about, which is the relationship with RFK, because I find that so fascinating where that even starts and how that even picks up. But what do you think, like with Vietnam? I mean, he's just accepting McNamara's words. He's accepting George Reedy's words. He's accepting Richard Russell's words, who's went on, what is it, that one show and talked about how we were doing a coup every other week over there. Like it's, there's these kind of conflict where it seems like, is LBJ even paying attention to the problem himself, or is he just accepting what people are giving him? Back to the interview with George Reedy, he said, one person will only bring something up to the president one time, but when the president gives his opinion on what he wants to happen, everything is in line with that opinion. There is no second guessing. There is no, but what about this? Very few people challenged LBJ. I've kind of through listening.
I would certainly agree that LBJ was, as people say, a political animal all the way through. He saw every problem in terms of politics and very much including Vietnam. So absolutely, he was very attentive to media reporting, to public opinion polls, where the public essentially stood on this problem. I would tend to downplay the extent to which his advisors sort of controlled LBJ or pushed him in a certain direction. I mean, Robert McNamara is a fascinating and controversial and problematic character in a lot of ways. But in 1962, 1963, he had gone along with JFK when JFK's instinct was actually to de-escalate American involvement in Vietnam. I think McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, when LBJ came into office, realized, aha, our new president is very gung-ho on Vietnam. He does not want to lose or back away under any circumstances. And so we are going to give him the advice that will support that particular outlook. I mean, on LBJ's first day in office, he really lays down his approach to Vietnam and says, look, let us all think every day about what we can do to achieve victory in Vietnam. So I think, this may not necessarily be a compliment to these guys, but I think people like Bundy, McNamara could have argued it either way or argued it a lot of different ways. They understood that their boss really wanted to avoid any setbacks under any circumstances, and they gave him the advice that they believed would best support the policy they thought he wanted to pursue.
What would you say besides Vietnam was another big problem that LBJ dealt with his presidency?
I mean, race, civil rights for sure.
What about media? Because like I said, bringing it kind of back to the beginning aspect of it, he was very, I don't know, his Southern aspect, if you can understand that, you can understand why the media might have felt certain ways. Like they had an article he talked to John Connolly on the phone with, I think in August of like 65. And he started talking about, do you hear we almost got ran off the road or something like that? And then he brings up another story from like the Houston Post or whatever Times or something. And he starts talking about how the reporter that rode with him, he grabbed a beer and he chucked it out, but it was on his own property. But they kind of threw it a whole different way to make him seem like this reckless kind of racist endangerment to society. And like, this is who our president is. And he's like, no, he's a Southerner. He's from Texas. He might do things differently. Like for him, going to have a beer with a reporter is not the stereotypical president you might have from like New York or DC that might just want to sit with you in a press room. He wants to go. Most of his conversations were walking around the garden, where it was like, it's not that he didn't want to be taped. Maybe that's a part of it, but really he just wanted to get out and not feel like he was stuck with a bunch of cameras and microphones around him. Hearing him kind of explain that a little bit, and I go, yeah, you know what? That's funny because there's 30 reporters all writing the same story on the same exact press conference, yet everyone has a different tale of it.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, I think there probably was some, you know, bias, some suspicion of this Southerner, the guy who spoke with a thick Southern accent. But on the other hand, the media knew LBJ. He'd been in DC since the 1930s. He had been on the cover of Time magazine multiple times. I mean, he was a well-known figure. So I probably wouldn't go too far down the road of buying into the idea that he was somehow, treated differently from other leading figures in Washington. Sam Rayburn, other Southerners had also really thrived in Washington, despite whatever biases might have existed against Texans or Southerners. So I don't want to rule out that that might have been a problem from time to time, but I think I wouldn't be particularly drawn to the idea that it was a significant obstacle. I think LBJ was rather thin-skinned. I mean, presidents certainly tend generally to be that way. They're very attentive to how they're described, to shifts in public opinion. LBJ was no exception. And I think you see as the presidency advanced and he ran into more and more problems, especially on Vietnam, but also urban unrest and other political problems, he became much, much more critical of the press. But it's hard not to read that in my mind, at least, as in part just a frustration with the fact that things weren't going his way anymore.
Do you believe he actually cared about keeping the promises that Kennedy had, or do you believe that this was just something he was doing for poll results? They showed in a poll that like 24% of people at the time believed that Johnson would actually carry on Kennedy's policies, and then a lot of them said they were unsure. And obviously, he cared a lot about polls. He cared a lot about press stories. But I just wondered if I'm a Kennedy, that's where I started. I'm interested in Kennedy as well. But it's, the description people who study the Kennedy kind of administration or history are not giant fans of LBJ and kind of see it as like some type of thing he was taking away from Kennedy. Do you think it could have been more fulfilling the promises like he said he was doing?
Yeah, I think that LBJ sincerely wanted to see Kennedy's agenda through. I think that there, strictly in terms of policy objectives, there was a lot of overlap. So when LBJ came into office, the big issues were civil rights, the tax cut, and LBJ picked up on those priorities in part because he knew that he could exploit sympathy for JFK to get these early wins in his administration. But there were also things I think that he himself strongly supported. And, with a lot of what became the Great Society and that LBJ probably deserves most credit for, you can see continuities in some cases going back to FDR or Harry Truman, but certainly between Kennedy and LBJ. So Kennedy had expressed a lot of interest in poverty, and he hadn't developed it into a policy agenda, but LBJ built out the war on poverty. So you can see connections there. Medicare, Medicaid, right? These are ideas that had gone back at least to FDR. Kennedy was deeply interested, but didn't develop them into policy plans. So there was a lot of consistency there. And none of this is to take anything away from LBJ. I think he really deserves credit for being the president who contributed to transforming these ideas into actual legislation. And then, of course, signing the legislation that was adopted by Congress. So I would say in the domestic arena, there's a great deal of continuity between what were often very broad ideas and broad objectives in Kennedy's mind and really practical realities in LBJ's.
Do you think it would have been a different remembrance of presidency for LBJ if he didn't have to deal with all the foreign problems? If he just dealt with the domestic? It seemed like a large focus for him was the domestic, but the foreign stuff kept coming in and he was kind of like, and, saying very short words on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've often said that, the two bad bets that LBJ made were, one, that the economy would remain as strong and robust as it appeared to be when he came into office. That was essential to keeping enthusiasm rolling for the Great Society. And the other was that the international scene would remain relatively quiet so that he could keep the American public and Congress focused on his domestic agenda. Both of those turned out to be bad bets. And to your point, in the international arena, LBJ, I would argue, was actually quite lucky when he came into office in 1963, really through 1964. There were a few crisis areas: Panama, Brazil, Vietnam was on the back burner, but bubbling along. But he was lucky for about a year and a half in that he really didn't face too many major foreign policy problems. It was really in 1965 that Vietnam really started to bite, and to show up day after day after day on the front pages of newspapers and to compete with his domestic agenda. And we all know what happened after that. It really grew and grew and kind of consumed his domestic agenda. But for a time, he was lucky, and then his luck really ran out.
I think we've all heard about the three wise men, but I kind of want to get from your perspective, who would you consider, I guess, the most influential into LBJ's administration? Not good, influential. And then in your mind, who would you consider positive influences, and also who would be some negatives?
Interesting. So you mean in connection with foreign policy, like the
Just with his administration as a whole, dealing with any issues, or who was generally out there to support LBJ rather than just give him information. I can see a few times there were issues dealing with Walter Heller and other people that were involved in the administration. George Reedy genuinely seemed like he was there to help Johnson. Robert McNamara was kind of eh. And then Larry O'Brien later on became more influential. In the beginning, though, was very cold. After when Johnson's calling in the beginning after Kennedy's killed, and it's like the day of, or it's the day after, or it's that week after. Very short conversations with certain individuals, but longer conversations with others, saying, "Hey, I want you on my administration. You worked for him. You did good work for him. I want you to do the same thing for me. I want to fulfill his." He's using that as like, "Hey, join my team a little bit." It's a little bit gross, but he also kind of develops thicker relationships and also kind of gets taken away from some. Ted Sorensen's a good example. Ted Sorensen quitting to write his book about JFK. LBJ still trying to help him out, still trying to get him to be a speechwriter. But even, I forgot who he's talking to, Nancy Dickerson. She was like, "I've never seen him like that before. He was so mean, and obviously he's going through a lot with the loss of Kennedy. He just can't get over it." And they're kind of explaining, but that's someone that he wasn't able to use for his administration. But LBJ wanted to, he just couldn't convince him to stay on board. So I was curious what your thoughts are on these various individuals that are involved in his administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's useful to distinguish between the domestic arena and the international arena. I think one of the things that's striking is that in the domestic arena, LBJ really interacted with and relied on a big cast of characters. So you've mentioned many of them, um, Heller and Reedy. Abe Fortas is an important one. O'Brien, um, Bill Moyers, toward the end, Tom Johnson. Right, there were. Depending on the issue, LBJ really had a striking capacity and really a deep interest in finding the right people to work with him to advance his agenda. And he was very good at putting together expert committees to really dig into, the details of poverty or the environment or education or what have you. I think in the international arena, maybe as a function of the fact that he was less secure in that area, he tended to rely on a very limited number of advisors. And here, McNamara, Bundy, Dean Rusk at first, I think, were his big three. Later on, Walt Rostow and Rusk, it seems to me, would be the big two who were left standing. So partly as a result of his relatively open-minded approach in the domestic arena, I think he was getting a greater variety of advice and maybe better advice in the international arena. The amount of the types of advice he was getting were much more limited, I think, and it's much more important, I think, in connection with Vietnam or other foreign policy problems, really to understand the details of those relationships because they really matter so much. I think, the LBJ Heller, LBJ Fortas, LBJ Hubert
Hubert
Humphrey,
Humphrey, where he's, yeah,
they,
he's,
they,
he's
they don't
yelling at
matter
him.
as much because there were so many people in the room when these issues were getting discussed, whereas the international ones really do matter.
I listened to at least a 10-minute conversation with him and Hubert Humphrey, and he's just sitting there the whole time, kind of going, "Can you just not tell the press this type of?" And Humphrey's kind of like, "Well, I think I could say it like this." And he's like, can you just don't say anything to the press? Like, how hard is it for you? He ends up cursing later down into the conversation. He's like, I'm trying to tell you, don't say anything. And Humphreys just keeps rephrasing it and trying to go. And then he goes, okay, I think I understand. He goes, when you release it, can I say something? And it's just like, really, why are you adding that on to the end of it? But I thought it was interesting. He didn't lean on RFK as much. I kind of wanted to get into the RFK part of this because that kind of relationship is always fascinating. I now again, I kind of want to preface it with the fact that everyone always mentions when you're putting up a clip that might be different than their view of LBJ, they kind of go, he was being recorded. That is very true. He talked about the transcripts, but also I don't think LBJ cared as much. I'm sure he tried to make himself look a certain way for some things, but overall, he's going to do whatever. I've heard multiple different like extended pieces or add-ons. Like I don't know if you've noticed, but discoverlbj.com and then the Miller Center, there's different conversations, whether it's parts that are missing or it's chopped up. And sometimes the dates are a little bit different. So it's been a little bit confusing to try and get into it all. But I always thought it was interesting, the relationship with RFK, because I could try to find out, like, my grandma was a big fan of RFK. Like, that's every, so like the whole background there was like RFK is this amazing dude and he was going to be so good for the country, which a lot of people believe. But the LBJ side of things, he kind of seems like a little pest. He's constantly just being revengeful and going after LBJ, whether it's putting stuff in LBJ's opinion into the polls or writing articles about LBJ or the William Manchester book. And I kind of wanted to talk to you about the relationship with RFK. When did it go bad, or how much did LBJ really care for RFK, or was he just doing it because he was being recorded?
Yeah. In this case, I think that whatever tension, hostility exists on the tapes is very, very revealing. I don't think that these guys disguise their dislike for each other. And exactly how far back that goes is, I suppose, a difficult question to answer. But I think there's plenty of evidence that really almost from the first time these guys met, they took a dislike to each other. There's a story about LBJ meeting the very young RFK in a Senate dining hall when RFK was a staffer, and the two men just kind of taking an instant dislike to each other. But clearly, as the JFK presidential campaign rolled around in 1959, 1960, Bobby Kennedy was attuned to LBJ's status as a very prominent rival for the Democratic nomination. And then, of course, when JFK came out on top and LBJ lost out, LBJ still stood out as an important vice presidential possibility. And many people around JFK thought that LBJ was the right guy because he was a Southerner. He was perceived as coming from a different wing of the Democratic Party. So for all those reasons, he was the front runner for the vice presidency. But RFK really hated that idea, I think, in part because of his visceral personal dislike for LBJ. Famously, RFK tried to undo the offer once it had been made to LBJ to become the vice presidential candidate. So all this got these two guys off, I think, on a very bad foot. And then they had to deal with each other during the Kennedy administration when RFK was the attorney general and LBJ was vice president. There's plenty of evidence that RFK really tried to marginalize LBJ. He had a lot of supporters, I think, in that agenda, but RFK was certainly at the front of the pack in terms of denigrating LBJ as this kind of Southern hick and keeping him out of the most important meetings. And then, of course, when the assassination came along, RFK had all the more reason to resent LBJ as kind of the usurper, right? The person who had unfairly been given the vice presidency and now was president, right? And held the office that his brother had won in 1960. So RFK sticks around a little bit in the administration, but leaves pretty quickly. And then, the two men had a pretty tense relationship thereafter, because I think LBJ feared that RFK would, jump into presidential politics and, make a run of his own in a way that would challenge LBJ for reelection or try to discredit or take away his accomplishments. So there were a lot of reasons that, and the relationship built well, deteriorated over time as new layers of resentment, new layers of rivalry um, uh, came along. But I quite agree with you. It's a fascinating relationship.
Do you think it really kind of deteriorated when he chose not to select RFK as his VP? It seemed like right from that moment, I can kind of pinpoint where everything starts declining. Eventually, he's not able to get a hold of RFK. But he did it in such a interesting way, which was I don't want it to seem like I'm just saying no to RFK, so I have to include Richard Russell. I have to include all these names that didn't even want the vice presidential spot, but he was not trying to just make it look like he was singling out RFK if he didn't want him in the first place. But also, do you believe RFK was owed that vice presidency spot since his brother was the president and then, LBJ takes over? It kind of seemed like for him, he seemed like he was owed that VP spot, that he should have it, and it was rightfully his, and he didn't get it, and that's what really ticked him off.
I mean, yeah, I suppose RFK probably felt that way. His supporters probably felt that way. In my own personal view, I mean, I certainly wouldn't have a very critical view of LBJ's decision making. I mean, every president gets to choose their vice president, and LBJ wouldn't have been the first president to to pass over a VP candidate who promised to overshadow him. I mean, I think this probably happens all the time. You know, one of the reasons I think why Obama liked Biden is he was kind of a safe bet not to steal the limelight, right? And I'm sure we could find countless other examples. So I can completely understand why LBJ would have shied away from a figure who was going to draw a lot of attention and probably, undermine the stature of the president himself. I mean, we can see that as a kind of juvenile rivalry, but we can also, I think, see that as coming from a concern that, he wanted the presidency to function properly and for the president to be sort of the top dog in his own administration. So, it makes good sense to me that RFK wasn't the right choice under those circumstances.
What do you think about the kind of remembrance or cultural remembrance of LBJ? A lot of it, like I said, I believe comes from those Kennedy administration type things and a lot of people that favored him, but he comes off very brutish. That's what I always thought of LBJ, as like someone, he's a bit of that for sure. But I believe that everything that's been kind of said is like this oilman type. A lot of it's just like, I don't know, listening to his tapes, I have him through a different light. Maybe I'm just brainwashed by his tapes, but it seemed like a lot of the cultural remembrance of LBJ of being this child killer, Vietnam causing and all. It's just like I see it constantly in the comments, and I'm just like, I don't see that Southern racist that you guys see. I kind of seen a more complicated person. Again, might have simple strategies to solving things, but the overall understanding of the inner working of politics and how these different states run. I mean, he talked to Hoover and a bunch of other people that you can't be having investigations in Texas without the authority of Texas giving you the okay. You're going to be stepping onto a whole other place and you let Texas handle this. He understood that because he was from there, but also he was like-minded like this in every decision he made when it came to more of the modern controversial politics that had to deal with like elections and other things.
Yeah, yeah. One of the problems I think is that LBJ was just so complicated, right? Bill Moyers famously said LBJ was 14 of the most interesting people he'd ever met. He was a lot of things, and of course, by the time he became president, he had been a prominent figure for a long time, and he changed, I think, is something that we should bear in mind. So LBJ wasn't like any of us, I suppose, wasn't a static figure. If you read Robert Caro's biographies carefully, as many people have, you can see there's a lot of kind of ugly stuff. And if you're looking for the crude, the crass LBJ, the bully, you can find that much more readily in the 1940s and 1950s than I think you can during the 1960s. So, if you want to cherry pick your evidence and find evidence of that crude bullying LBJ, there's plenty to work with. What I would argue is that, by the time he became president, a lot of that more boorish, crude behavior is less easy to find, and perhaps he had changed in fundamental ways. He'd become more of a national figure, a man who is accustomed to the national limelight, more presidential in some ways. So, I don't want to rule out the possibility that those uglier, cruder LBJs have some validity to them. But I think we should bear in mind that he wasn't always that way, or that's not the only way to think about him, and perhaps that it's less important by the time you get to the years that when LBJ reached the peak of his power.
Does he seem democratic or like a Democrat to you? Because I've had a lot of people comment LBJ was never a Democrat, and I'm like, look, I'm almost 30, but I'm just letting you guys. This person's double my age, and I'm kind of like, I think you can easily Google it, and you could see that he definitely was a Democrat. But a lot of people bring up points of him having a lot of Republican people around him, or certain people that kind of fit that style. And I go, I don't think he matches the Democrat today. You'd have to take it back to the '60s, and even Robert F. Kennedy similar in democratic progressive means, but overall, like you look at a lot of his stuff, he's kind of like a conservative a little bit in his mentality. I mean, he was pro wiretapping. He was doing all this type of stuff that LBJ was complaining about multiple times with Ramsey Clark. And to me, it was just interesting because I'm like, oh, I like all these people. These are just like the cast of characters I want to see in a sitcom or something.
I mean, I think you have to see LBJ within the context of his political moment. And the 1950s, 1960s were obviously very different time politically from the one where we live now. And LBJ was hardly unique in being a prominent American politician who could work across the aisle, who could be different things to different people, who built a whole political career in the pragmatic political center of the spectrum. I mean, it seems to me JFK was a very similar politician. Richard Nixon was a very similar politician. Hubert Humphrey, same. I mean, there was something about that moment that really propelled candidates into office who had the ability to create coalitions, sometimes across party. But this reflected the fact that the parties in that era were very different from what they are now. Now we have homogenous parties that more or less march in lockstep. I mean, back then there were members of the Democratic Party, especially from the South, who were, to the right of people in the Republican Party. Both parties had liberal and conservative wings, and they were both coalitions of different elements in American society. And so unsurprisingly, I think the presidents who won office and worked effectively in that job were people who could maneuver in a much more flexible, fluid environment that permitted, working across the aisle. To me, far from criticizing an LBJ or even a Nixon or a Kennedy for that style of politics, I think, this was an enormous strength. And that era was a much healthier one, I think, than our own, where, reasonable people came together depending on the issue in the spirit of solving problems with much less attention to who belonged to which party. And, there was a sense of trust and open-mindedness and constructiveness in their approach. I think that's largely missing. That's the best thing about LBJ, I think, that I wish we could bring back, to our own political moment.
Do you believe that LBJ was more effective as a president or was he more effective as a vice president? The reason why I kind of bring that up is Reedy from an interview kind of explained that the Kennedy administration never truly fully used the power of Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it's not just Reedy saying that. That's Malcolm Kilduff as well, too. He states that in an interview, and he believed that he was completely underutilized during the Kennedy administration. They would put him off to India or have him do something that's not what he should be doing. And it seemed like with Johnson finally taking over the presidency, you got to see his kind of jump into it and trying to tackle problems that would have been probably more effective if a vice president was handling them.
I think clearly he was underutilized during the vice presidency, and Bobby Kennedy had a good deal to do with that. I think just pushing him to the margins. There are all sorts of accounts that LBJ was really kind of depressed during that period. He really felt as though he had been demoted to, a very second or third or fourth tier position, despite being vice president of the United States. The answer to your question, if you'll permit me, in my mind, might be that he was most effective as Senate Majority Leader. That was really the pinnacle of LBJ's political career, his effectiveness. I mean, he really transformed that role. And, he's been called the master of the Senate by Robert Caro and others. And I think there's a lot to that. He really, worked closely with Dwight Eisenhower to to help the Eisenhower presidency, speaking of bipartisanship, by the way, achieve some of the most important achievements of that era of American politics. He was marginalized certainly during the vice presidency. And then during the presidency, I don't want to dismiss for a second, there were enormous accomplishments. But of course, there was also Vietnam. There was also the crack up of the Democratic Party. There was also urban unrest and crime and violence and all the other things that really started to dog the administration in its final years.
When it came to understanding kind of the similarities between Johnson's administration and Kennedy's administration, what stands out the most to you? Because for me, I'm looking at the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, and I do kind of see similar tracks, but also kind of very different. But there is kind of a lot of similar issues in dealing with certain things, like for instance, the Secret Service. So much gets said. I'm going to take an example for the Kennedy assassination. A lot of people talk about the Secret Service. They wanted it to happen. That's not necessarily true because I have about, I think, 4 times over 3 years, Johnson's complaining to James Rowley about the Secret Service, saying, you got 110 soldiers lined up, about to fall over, and a gun go off and get me killed or something, which is weird that he used that exact example, but he complained about the Secret Service a lot, whether it's they're driving right behind him, whether they always have to publish something in a newspaper about where he's going. Why can't he just do this without 50,000 helicopters following him? He seemed to have a big problem. And then there's the famous conversation with Floyd Boring, where he basically says, get Floyd Boring on the phone, or, this, and goes, what the heck? And he just starts cursing at Floyd Boring, who was a driver. So it gets into this whole thing where you start realizing, like, okay, it's not just a Kennedy administration problem. It's kind of like, it's just seems like we just kind of have higher expectations for the Secret Service, whether that's
Yeah.
Hoover's, like how he's propagandizing his FBI or like the top of all time. It could just be, it's good to people think that their Secret Service, like you can't get anywhere near the president. The Secret Service would stop you. Well, a lot of people got near the president pretty easily because the Secret Service, I think it's not Malcolm Kilduff, but Clint Hill talks about the drinking problem that was with the Secret Service. And Abraham Bolden, first black Secret Service person, also talks about the drinking problem that's going on. They're just like in their 20s. I mean, for God's sakes, we can't judge them, can't blame them. But it just kind of seeing that he dealt with that same issue that Kennedy dealt with
Yeah.
was very interesting to me, where I'm like, oh, it's kind of fun to see the similarities between the two, even though they're so distinct personalities that are so different. But the administration, the background, the environment that they're in the office is quite similar.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I have to confess, I don't know the stories that you've just been touching on about the attitudes toward the Secret Service, but that does strike me as quite revealing. In terms of differences and similarities, I'll offer you one of each. I think, and when it comes to differences, one striking difference I think I would point to is that JFK was, I think we all know, really good in public settings. He was a great orator. He had great speechwriters for one thing, but he also really knew how to give a speech and inspire people, right? We think of the inauguration address in 1961, but we can probably also think of other speeches. And this was JFK at his best. But behind the scenes, JFK was notoriously kind of aloof, a little bit prickly, didn't really know how to work a room very well, right? Wasn't was cautious, right? But LBJ was in some ways the exact opposite. I think he wasn't a great speaker. His speeches, even his best ones, I think, at least to my eye, come across as a bit wooden. It's certainly not known as a great orator, but behind the scenes, man, in a smoke-filled room, in small groups around a table, there was just nobody better, right? He really knew how to work a room, how to persuade people, how to tell a story, and I think there's a fascinating difference, which I suppose just simply boils down to personality between these two men. But when it comes to similarities, I mean, this is like the broadest possible answer I suppose I could offer to that question. But both Kennedy and LBJ, I think, shared a sense that that government, that the authority, the instruments, the resources that could be marshaled by government, and especially the federal government, had the ability to solve problems in American life. I think both were fundamentally pragmatists who believed that government should be in the business of solving problems. And if votes came from the other side of the aisle, that was fine. And that was not something to run from. In fact, it was something to be embraced. And they really stand out historically, I think, as the quintessential embodiments of this idea, which of course is now very much in disfavor, that government could be relied upon, was the appropriate instrument for bringing reform and change to American life. These two guys really were the kind of high point, I think, of that ethos.
Do you think dealing with the Vietnam issue or kind of the blowback from Vietnam and that being his giant main problem was kind of also messed with on the concept of all the scandals that were coming out at the time? We have the Baker investigation and, Bobby Baker, that whole issue that happened. We have people giving testimony, Don Reynolds, certain things getting published in papers. It seemed like LBJ kind of got very protective. Like, again, you mentioned thin skin. That became a large amount of what he was dealing with when it came to the Walter Jenkins issue that he had as well too. I mean, that hurt him. You could hear later on, and he's trying to talk with Walter about it. He's trying to make statements to cover Walter's reputation, but it seems like he was overall not looking at the reputation as a country dealing with the problems of Vietnam. He's looking at, okay, there's this problem, but how is this going to reflect on my legacy? Again, we want the Great Society to be his legacy, which is getting influenced by the Vietnam War, which is can't do both things. I think Richard Russell said that in an interview too. But there was so much going on that when it came to the big problems of Vietnam and it came to problems with his reputation as a person or as what he's going to be remembered as, he focused a lot on the personal, the Baker stuff, the other things that were constantly being printed in the press. I mean, he's caring about what blank whoever Herald Tribune is writing about him or what stories, how can I discredit those? How can I call up that person and have that person stop writing those articles because they're untrue? And it's like, where's the foreign policy discussion here, man? Like you're getting sucked right back in the domestic, which is why I always thought that he would have been a better just as a domestic president rather than focusing on the outside influences. But that's not how the presidency works. And we see kind of like a different, more interpretation of, the errors of LBJ's ways. But I'm just curious, when it came to other things that were influencing him and caring more about his reputation rather than the whole presidency, what would you say to that?
I think there's something in what you're getting at, but I think that as a historian who's looked at decision making in multiple presidencies, I see a lot of the kind of thing that you're talking about really across the board. I think we have this idea sometimes that presidents, only deal with these, super high profile, consequential issues and are thinking about them in very principled and, philosophical ways. But I think politics, no surprise here, is often about the mundane. It's about who likes who. It's about trade-offs. It's about what's politically possible at a given moment, or what's going to happen if you make this decision in terms of your freedom of maneuver further down the road. So LBJ was very much a maneuverer, someone who is always thinking a few steps ahead. And so maybe there's reason to say that he was particularly a president of this type. But I think that really all presidents, when you really get into the records that we have available to us, we can see, we're also thinking incrementally more than we might sometimes think about the peculiar circumstances of the moment. Which isn't to say, I think we should guard against the tendency to think that that's the wrong thing, and that presidents should always be operating, in a very abstract and philosophical level. I mean, politics really is a messy business a lot of the time, and we want our leaders to be effective, and effectiveness sometimes comes from being aware of those more mundane details.
What would you say on just the relationship between LBJ and Eisenhower? He called him a lot and asked him about a lot of problems that were going on to get his opinion. He did the same thing with Richard Russell. They're both very influential. And I think even in one tape, LBJ's giving an answer to something, and Richard Russell says you should do it like this, and then LBJ says something like the student has become the master. Like you obviously have been out of it for too long because you don't understand this, that, and he's like basically then tables have turned. But those two figures, what do you think about them being involved in LBJ's ear?
I really think, and I admit that I'm drawing a lot on Robert Caro's work here, um, that the relationship between LBJ and Eisenhower really shows off LBJ at his very best. He understood in his years as Senate Majority Leader that he could play a very constructive relationship alongside Eisenhower. He could use his position to become, in some ways, the second most powerful figure in Washington. He understood that Eisenhower had real problems with the right wing of his own, that is the Republican Party, and that Democrats in some ways could step into the void and become strong supporters and important votes for the Eisenhower presidency. So these two men really, coming from different parties, political rivals at some level, really forged a kind of effective partnership in the middle of the political spectrum, and that says something about the bipartisan, open-ended character of politics in that period, as we've discussed. But I think it also reflected personal calculation on both of these men's part that this could be an effective way of getting things done. And of course, it was good for both of them in the sense that it raised their profiles by getting things done and establishing a record of political success.
Do you believe having too many friends in the administration, speaking from LBJ's point of view, is can sometimes be a bad thing? If we take like a name like John Connolly, obviously that relationship, he was very cared about John Connolly's feelings and certain things, and always was asking, calling up John Connolly on opinions and stuff that was going on more Texas political related rather than dealing with other issues. But you heard stories come out about, John Connolly resigning or some type of feud between John Connolly and LBJ. And eventually you start getting into a point where LBJ is talking to Walter Jenkins, like, why is John just kind of ignoring me? And he's kind of focused on like this weird relationship. And they had been friends for a long time. I mean, John Connolly worked for LBJ for a long time. But it was kind of like this unhealthy, healthy relationship, if that makes sense. Like sometimes it's good to have people that necessarily aren't your friends around you because you need to be told honest truths or something that kind of can conflict with your personal viewpoint on things. And if you got two Texans that are making decisions that are thinking the exact same thing, it's going to be very hard to get the most reasonable conclusion to it. You're just going to get the one that you both agree with.
Yeah, I think there's something in what you're getting at. I think LBJ really across his life had a really striking tendency to forge mentor-mentee relationships, often with mentors, that is, older people who helped him along in his political career. And then there are also a few striking examples of his taking on the role as mentor to someone like John Connolly, who also had this very, very tight bond. I don't know whether, I mean, I suppose these relationships kind of cut both ways. I mean, they were clearly central to LBJ's political rise. First, it was FDR, and then it was Rayburn, and then, it was Richard Russell. And I'm not sure we'd be talking about a president LBJ if he hadn't had that capacity to forge those kind of relationships with older men who could really advance his career. This really speaks to something I was getting at earlier. LBJ's uncanny ability in small groups or even in one-on-one settings, really to forge these really tight bonds and that were really consequential, not just gratifying in terms of the friendships they created, but also consequential to his rise to power. But there may be something too to this idea that he was somewhat more limited than he might otherwise have been in terms of the loyalties and the advice he was getting, and maybe he would have done better to think more broadly or to have a wider circle of friends, friends and influences. But in some arenas, particularly in domestic policy, when he got into the presidency, as I've already mentioned, I think he actually did a pretty good job of consulting a pretty wide circle of experts. So I'm not sure at the end of the day this was really a major problem so much as just kind of an interesting characteristic of his leadership.
Do you ever think he resented the presidency? having it. Obviously, later years, you start hearing him be more critical of like, I don't know why the hell they gave this to me. It's just like this type. He's going on about the problems, the issues. I had to speak with this guy, and this guy got a meeting here and a meeting there, and I'm not going to have time to sleep and all this type of stuff. He seemed like everyone kind of brings up the point of like him being so bloodthirsty for the whole presidency in general. And then once he's kind of in it for a few years and has it, he's very like pushing it off. Like, I don't want it. And it's hard to tell, is he being serious on it or is he just joking because everybody knows the presidency's like one of the most difficult things to do?
Yeah. I mean, I think LBJ in some ways is a tragic figure because it's clear that, he fantasized about the presidency from, his childhood. And then, as it became more of a possibility for him, it seemed like it's something that he went for, repeatedly across the 1950s. He really had a very bold vision of what the presidency could accomplish. And that really underlay, the Great Society, I think, maybe underlay his decisions about foreign policy as well. But I think one of the things that LBJ discovered was that as president, you're actually limited in more ways than he might have believed when, he thought broadly about what the office might be like. I think it's reasonable to say, with the benefit of hindsight, that he tried to do too much. He got himself into trouble by having too grand a vision of what the presidency could accomplish. I mean, all of the Great Society obviously fueled a political backlash based on the idea that government had gotten too big, too expensive, too invasive. And of course, his belief that American power internationally could solve even an incredibly vexing problem like Vietnam got him into a world of trouble there as well. So, his vision of the presidency was, I suppose, an admirable one in the sense that he believed that this institution could be used to promote real, tangible reform and improvement for ordinary people's lives. But you could reasonably say that it proved to be an unrealistic vision of what the presidency could be, and that he ran into a lot of troubles because he simply tried to do too much.
Just got a couple more questions for you, but do you believe that he was pigeonholed at all when it came to the fact of the Kennedy assassination or comparisons to Kennedy constantly being brought up? Polls, stories, all these things, he was constantly being compared to how Kennedy did things. I think even one conversation was that he needs to do a press conference because Kennedy did this many press conferences and he hasn't really done any. And then he did one, he was like, I'm never doing this again.
Yeah.
Like, because it was just like something that was different for him. But a lot of people kept bringing up like that Kennedy thing could not be let go. It constantly had to be a reminder of, this incident in 63 or this person who kind of overshadowed you. And LBJ, I mean, I think he grew out of it, but it constantly nagged at him.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the right way to put it. It was constantly on his mind. It fades a little bit over time, but he really resented the comparisons and was probably driven to make some of the decisions that he made as president by a desire to head off some of the criticism that might come his way if he chose otherwise. And I don't particularly put a lot of stock in this, but there is this idea out there that one of the reasons he escalated in Vietnam was because he simply could not tolerate the idea that he would be criticized for failing in in a part of the world where Kennedy had committed the United States and had made a stand. So it's possible, and it might be part of the mix of motivations that led LBJ to escalate there. But generally, I think you're on to something important. This sense of anxiety and about the comparisons and how he would appear in history was something that I think really weighed on him.
If you could say one thing kind of wrapping up here about the Johnson administration that you'd want people to kind of take away from Johnson's whole presidency, and that's a big ask to just choose like kind of one kind of way to put it, but more on the lines of trying to get people interested as well too, into looking into the Johnson administration, examining some of those tapes, examining other influences. I got a lot of stuff from the tapes and other interviews and kind of changed my perspective. I had learned about JFK and RFK before I learned about LBJ. So I'm already going into it not supposed to like LBJ and then kind of getting a change of it and kind of having a more balanced perspective where I don't say it's just LBJ's fault. I kind of go, it's faults on all sides. Everyone was retaliating in this weird political, teenage, high school, gossipy, mishmash type way. And I'm curious, I want people to be able to go and look at these things as well too. So I also want you to get you to say your links for anything you have, whether your books, LBJ, library, anything like that. That would be a good resource for people to look at. But I wanted to get your main takeaway from the LBJ administration, and then also what you would recommend people doing when it came to looking further into the administration.
Uh, well, I appreciate that. And, I think the big idea that I would love for people to have in their heads about LBJ and this period of history that is now, 60 plus years ago, um, is that LBJ represented and embodied a style of politics that is very much in disfavor these days, but I think needs to be part of the range of alternatives we bear in mind when we think about how we can possibly change our own political culture in the United States at a period when, regardless of where people stand, I think we would probably all agree, we have a lot of problems to solve. LBJ was someone who believed very strongly, as I've mentioned, maybe too strongly, that the presidency and that government, the federal government more generally, could achieve great things if it was trusted and empowered and had the resources at its disposal. And I think you can see, particularly in 1963, 1964, 1965, that there were enormous accomplishments that came when government functioned well. The executive, Congress, the courts, were working hand in hand to solve problems like race or in the hope of solving problems like race relations, like poverty, like a deteriorating environment. The solutions weren't perfect for sure, but these were obviously major breakthroughs that push things, I would argue, and I think maybe a lot of people would argue, in a favorable direction. So there are all sorts of reasons these days, I think, why people are distrustful of government, but it's useful to bear in mind the LBJ period, I think, as an example of a period when the debate around government was very, very different, and there was more confidence, and things really got done. Tangible things got done that brought enormous improvements to a lot of people's lives. So we should rediscover LBJ, I think, for a lot of reasons, but above all, because he is someone who may have some lessons to offer for our own political moment.
Mr. Lawrence, I appreciate you for doing my show and giving me the time to talk about LBJ. Like I said, I've been fascinated with his tapes. I've been trying to put it in a more video format for not only my own knowledge, but just for people to be able to hear some interesting conversations. I think a lot gets lost to books sometimes. They're important too, to have perspectives on things, but also hearing somebody, like hearing JFK curse, you're not shocked when you're like, okay, they're people. That's what they do. We just have this different vision based on movies and all these types of other things, especially my generation. But I want to give you the second here to be able to promote your books, where people can find them at, any website links you'd like to promote, any social media handles, anything you'd like. The floor is yours.
Sure, I appreciate that. I'm not much of a social media person, probably to my detriment, but I would thank you for the opportunity. I'll just mention my two of my more recent books that might have some interest. I have a broad narrative about the Vietnam War called The Vietnam War: A Concise International History, which I hope is a relatively accessible and certainly relatively brief overview of that history that's, I hope, well suited for anyone who's kind of approaching that topic without a lot of background. And then in 2021, I had a book that really delves deeply into the Johnson presidency called The End of Ambition, the United States and the Third World in the Vietnam era. When it comes to websites, there's one in particular that I would flag. When I was director of the LBJ Library, I worked closely with the Miller Center for Public Affairs, which you've mentioned, to develop a new website that features not all, certainly, but many of the most important and interesting of the telephone conversations And there are all kinds of links there to supporting documents, images, and so forth. It's a website that will, I hope, continue to be expanded in the years to come, but is already, I think, a pretty great go-to place for anyone who hasn't listened to these recordings and would like a relatively easy to use introduction to presidential recordings generally and the Johnson administration in particular.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Lawrence, and thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next